I met a gentleman a few weeks ago, and he gave me his card because he said, I am the official documenting photographer of the Shroud of Turin when they did the last test on the Shroud of Turin. If you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, it is said to be the burial cloth of Christ. And there's a lot of controversy about it because the carbon dating shows that it's not from the time of Christ. It's like 800 or 1,000 years later. And they can tell you that it's definitely not the Shroud of Christ, but they cannot explain the image on the shroud. It is almost a photographic negative of a body that has all of the wounds that Christ would have had. They can't tell you what it is, but they can tell you what it's not. Well, Barrie talks to me, and then all of a sudden, one of my producers, who was taking Torah study, hears about Barrie in her Torah study, and she reaches out to Barrie, and unbeknownst to me, she says, we got to get you on the show. So on this day that I come in to tell everybody we got to book Barrie, down in Texas, I'm in Idaho. My producer says, "Hey, we got to get Barrie on. I think he's going to be great." And I said, "Have I already told you guys about him?" "No, why?" "I think it's a God thing that he's on. His name is Barrie Schwortz, and he is joining us now." Hello, Barrie. How are you?
I'm doing great, Glenn. Thanks for having me on the program.
You bet. So, Barrie, you are the official documenting photographer. So you were up close and personal with the shroud. You took all of the pictures. Were you a believer that this was the burial garb of Christ when you first started?
Absolutely not, Glenn. I was a total skeptic. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. Although I'm a secular Jew and not practicing, I didn't really have any emotional attachment to the shroud. And my involvement mainly came from my background as a photographer and imaging specialist. And so I was invited onto the team to participate in the examination of the shroud. We spent 5 days and nights nonstop working around the clock back in 1978 and performed the first and only in-depth scientific study of that cloth that's ever been done in its history.
Okay, so you were one of three Jewish members of the Shroud team. Were there non-skeptics on the team?
I'm sure that a few of the members of the team were less skeptical than I was, let's put it that way.
Okay.
I think that most of the team members came from Los Alamos National Labs, Sandia Labs, Air Force Weapons Lab. So these were hardcore scientists, and thank God for that, because if they weren't hardcore scientists, the whole world might have blown up by now. So they were very meticulous and absolutely the most empirical scientists I've ever worked with.
Okay, so they did the tests, and they said it's the carbon dating is wrong, and it's not the shroud.
The carbon dating didn't happen until 10 years after we examined the shroud. Our team examined it, and our primary purpose was really to determine how that image was formed. Is it a painting? Is it a scorch? Or was it made photographically? And ultimately, the science eliminated all those possibilities. So as you said in the intro, we can tell you what it's not, but we don't know of a mechanism that can create an image on a piece of cloth with the same chemical and physical properties that we documented on the shroud.
So does it look like was it something that you were like, we can't explain it, but we can see somehow or another it's man-created?
Well, we don't believe it is. There's nothing been added to the surface of that cloth. And, that's just the first thing we looked for was any paint, pigments, binders, anything that would imply that something had been added to the cloth that would have created the image, and we found nothing. If anything, the image itself is made of yellow discolored fibers, and it's the concentration of those fibers in any given area that indicates the darkness of that area itself. So there really was nothing added there. So my initial response, even though I was totally skeptic, after about the first 15 minutes of looking at it with a 10x magnifier, I knew that there wasn't any paint on the surface of that. And ultimately, our mass spectrometry and chemical analyses, X-ray analyses, all of that showed that nothing has been added, no pigments, no paints, nothing has been added to that cloth to create that image.
I have to tell you, that's not what I thought the Shroud of Turin experts said. I've always thought that the scientific experts deny that this is, from the time period, and it was definitely man-made. It's not.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
You mentioned the radiocarbon dating, which was done 10 years after our team completed our work. And for decades after that, the world said, well, the shroud must be a fake. It took 27 years in the Freedom of Information Act to get the British Museum, that was the overseer of the three labs that did the radiocarbon testing. It took 27 years for the British Museum to release the raw data, which is very unusual. Historically, a scientist, once his work is published in a journal, will release the raw data so other scientists can either repeat the experiment, which is part of the scientific method, or perhaps take the information and try and go further with it. So we finally got the raw data, and we can understand why they didn't want to release it. It showed that the sample site, and there was only one sample taken, which is already bad science, it showed that that sample was inhomogeneous, meaning it was a strip that was cut, and there was one date at one end and hundreds of years later at the other end of that strip. So there was nowhere on that strip that we can claim gave us the date for anywhere else on that cloth. And they never took a control sample from anywhere else. So the radiocarbon dating...
So wait. Yeah. Wait, I want to make sure I understand this. So this was like a repair made later on the cloth?
Correct.
That they took?
Yep, there's evidence in that corner where the sample was taken that there's cotton interwoven, and that goes against Jewish law. It's called mixing of the kinds, and you're not supposed to mix wool with cotton or cotton with the linen. A burial shroud of someone of high stature is supposed to be pure linen, and yet we found cotton in the corner that was ultimately radiocarbon dated, and that implied that there was a repair or reweaving done in that corner. And so they dated a repaired corner of the shroud, which could not give us an accurate date for anywhere else on that cloth.
But how do you know that there isn't cotton through the rest of the fiber if you didn't test the rest of the fiber?
Well, during our examination, 5 days and nights in 78, we carefully examined, the shroud's almost 15 feet long. So while one scientist group was working at one side of the shroud or one end of the shroud, other researchers were evaluating other parts of the cloth. And Ray Rogers, our lead chemist from Los Alamos National Lab, probably spent more time in front of that cloth than all the rest of us put together with a microscope examining fibers from every part of that cloth. Okay. And we found no cotton anywhere else in that cloth, particularly interwoven. We were wearing white cotton gloves, and some of the white cotton from our gloves got onto the cloth. But that's modern cotton and distinguishable from ancient cotton.
So why would the British Museum do this?
Well, Glenn, it's hard for me to speak to this, but I will say this, that as soon as the results were leaked, even before their paper was published claiming the shroud was medieval, the British Museum, or rather the Oxford Laboratory, one of the three labs that examined the shroud, received £1 million from anonymous donors for debunking the shroud. And Dr. Michael Tide of the British Museum left the British Museum and took a permanent chair at Oxford with some of that money. So I hate to say follow the money, but perhaps that had some influence.
Okay, so you were a skeptic. You didn't believe in it. You're Jewish. You didn't feel emotional when you first approached the shroud, which I would think I would. Even if it isn't real, it is so inspiring. And, if somebody did it, it's a miracle they did it. We don't understand how they did it.
Right. Well, look.
But how do you feel? Go ahead.
I think we all had reverence for the subject matter. We all appreciated the fact that not only was this an object of scientific research, but it was also an object of faith for a billion or so people. So we all had great respect for it. And so although I didn't have the same emotional response that perhaps some of my Christian fellow team members might have had, we all treated it with the highest respect and regard and acted professionally throughout.
Sure. Now, how do you feel now?
Well, it took 17 years after we finished, and I had access, of course, to all of the scientific research. And after about 17 years, all of the questions that I had that had been unanswered became answered, and I had to resign myself to the fact that the most plausible explanation for this was that this is the burial shroud of the historic Jesus of Nazareth. You don't have to be a Christian to accept the historicity of Jesus and to accept that we might have an artifact of that man's life considering the impact he's had on this planet.